Next we have Professor Cole Durham. He's an internationally recognized authority on religion and the law, and so we're very fortunate to have him here today. He founded the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University in Utah, and he's president of the G20 Interfaith Association. So you can read his bio here, but you'll see he has he's worked all over the world and just tremendous experience in various nations and cultures, and so I'm very much looking forward to hearing what he has to say. What happened to the so Neil, please come on up and we'll get your computer, the computer set up for your PowerPoint.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. With only a short time to speak, I want to focus on the theme of this session at 4 broad levels. Briefly stated, I want to show that religion, religious freedom, and religious civil society institutions are historically, philosophically, empirically, and institutionally foundational for security and the rule of law. We live at a time when civil society institutions are facing shrinking social space, and when people are forgetting why religious freedom is so important for security and the rule of law. I'm trying to figure out how this works here. Can't quite. Oh, I've got a problem because just a minute. Come here. There should be a. Where's this thing on the side? No, there's this scroll thing. No, it's not okay. It's going to be a problem because I need to scroll this. No, this has got a scroll, but it's going to be different on every slide. No, but well, we'll do the best we can. I'm used to having a screen that works differently than this, and so I'll do my best. In any event, my argument is intended to be an antidote to these views that people forgetting that religious freedom is so important for security and the rule of law. Freedom of religion or belief, FORB, is foundational in several respects. It's historically foundational because other rights emerged as additional supports for or expansions of religious freedom rights. It is philosophically foundational because it protects the comprehensive belief systems in which other ideas are rooted and from which they derive their meaning. It's empirically foundational. Now it's a time-tested principle for advancing security and the rule of law. And it's institutionally foundational because it protects and fosters the institutions that engender the vision, the motivation, and the moral support that translate religious and moral ideals into practice. Freedom of religion and belief institutions are foundational for the rule of law. The idea of the rule of law designates a distinctive and historically rare form of law that contrasts with other forms of law. Customary law, often linked with religious systems, or bureaucratic law. In a way, the rule of law institutions that we associate with sophisticated legal systems in the West and in other developed systems the rule of law grows out of these other kinds of law and can relapse back into them. So we understand the rule of law has a number of characteristics that have been alluded to a little bit already. We think of certain characteristics of a legal system. The law, its rules are general. They're not retroactive. They're not vague. And there are other features that limit discretion of judges in applying the laws so that you can know in advance what you're expected to do. But it's more than just some characteristics of rules. The rule of law has a kind of autonomy in 4 respects. That is, in rule of law systems, the rule of law is substantively autonomous. It's not identifiable with particular religious, economic, or political beliefs. That's part of what Holmes was saying when he was saying that the rule of law is not some particular economic system. It's institutionally autonomous. It's applied by separate and distinct institutions, typically a judiciary that is separated and apart from other institutions. It's methodologically autonomous. It uses legal reasoning that, at least in theory, is separate from scientific, moral, political, and economic discourse. It's its own method. And it's occupationally autonomous. It's administered by a legal profession that is not simply subject to other bureaucracies. If these kinds of autonomy are lost, the system relapses back into a mere bureaucratic structure. These are characteristics that enable the law to be more than merely the rule of man. Now, there are historical presuppositions for this kind of law, which in fact in world history have been relatively rare. If you think about it, social pluralism tends to be a precondition. If you don't have a pluralistic society, there's no incentive to find a rule structure that will provide overarching solutions to conflicts. One of the things historically is there's been a separation of religion and state institutions. This goes way back in medieval history, goes back to the time of Magna Carta in England and other systems. And the point is that church or religious institutions were recognized to be different from state institutions, and there was something wrong if the state institutions intervened in religious space. Another interesting kind of presupposition is natural or higher law. It's not that was assumed that the legal system should necessarily embody that, but that the idea of something like natural law was important. Now the point here is that without social pluralism, a rule of law system does not emerge from customary or bureaucratic stages. Without separation of religion and state institutions, the various forms of autonomy of the rule of law state don't emerge. Without a notion of higher law, the notion of constitutionalism is unlikely to emerge. It makes possible the notion of law as more than the outcome of a clash of interests. The combination of these factors makes possible the notion of a rule of law as opposed to the rule of man. Okay. Now, what is significant here is that Forb is the foundational grandparent right that helps make possible the paradoxical fusion of a sense for higher law without a commitment to any particular religious tradition. This fusion lies at the foundation of our other rights. Forb, freedom of religion and belief, is the oldest of the internationally recognized human rights. It's linked with notions of dignity, rooted in the notion of being human beings being created in the image of God. It's the parent of other free expression rights. If you think of things like Milton's Areopagitica in the 17th century in England, that was an argument both for freedom of the press, but it was about arguments about religious issues. Religion is the original context of non-discrimination and equality rights. We tend to think of equality these days in terms of things like race or other kinds of factors, but originally the context was non-discrimination on the basis of religion. It's obviously tied to freedom of association as well. So you can see that one of the things is that the religion and freedom of religion is foundational historically for the other rights. Forb is philosophically foundational. Religious freedom protects the right to have different beliefs at the core of different communities. It's a reminder that state institutions are limited. Religious beliefs as a fundamental, what I want to say here is a fundamental reservation clause on the social contract. That is, Madison taught in sort of the lead up to our Constitution that religious obligations are somehow prior to the other forms of social contract like the Constitution. If you think about it, people who have a religious community and religious beliefs would not enter into a social contract if they thought that was going to cause them to violate their religious beliefs. So that just as in a treaty you can have a reservation clause as to some things you hold out of the treaty, so when people entered the social contract and constitutional notions, freedom of religion or belief is a basic starting point, and it's important to remember that that's a limitation on the state. It also protects the comprehensive belief systems in which other ideas are rooted and from which they have their meaning. So freedom of expression talks about expressing particular ideas, but in a way, freedom of religion is broader because it protects the whole setting in which other beliefs are found. Now, Forb is also empirically foundational. When modern constitutions embodying for protections were first adopted, the idea that societies could be founded on freedom of religion was at best a grand experiment based on Lockean theory. But we now have over 2 centuries of historical experience, both in the United States and in many other countries, confirming that a stable society can be predicated on religious freedom. And this is a stable society that can deal with the problems of security and reconcile them with the rule of law. This is a chart that many of you may have seen pointing out strong correlations between freedom of religion and other social goods. So, for example, there's a very strong correlation between countries that have freedom of religion protections with those who have strong political freedom, freedom of the press, civil liberties. This is not surprising because they're overlapped. But what's interesting is there are all kinds of other social goods that are stronger in countries that protect freedom of religion. So, gender empowerment is very high. Lower percentage of GDP spent on the military. I'm not going to read the whole list here, but the point is that there is now, based on a lot of empirical studies, relatively recent studies, showing high degrees of correlation between freedom of religion and many of these other social goods. This is a book by Brian Grimm and Roger Finke, which gathers much of that. It's a great book. But one of their key findings is a finding that was quite, in a way, surprising to people who normally deal with security issues. The key finding was that restrictions on religious freedom are highly correlated with and appear to be a significant factor in causing religious violence. Now think about this, because usually what happens when state officials see religious violence or interreligious violence, their reaction is to crack down on it and restrict it in various ways. But the point is, and this is sort of empirically found again and again, and this is validated by a lot of other studies, if you do that, you really make the security situation worse. So the instinctive reaction to crack down and tighten up restrictions is exactly what may be causing the problem. I mean, this is not to say that there aren't appropriate cases that you have to deal with and regulate, but it's saying you have to be very careful, because if you do it wrong, it'll be counterproductive. Now, unfortunately, one of the things we know is that while on the one hand we have better evidence than ever before that religious freedom is empirically linked to other social goods, the empirical situation in the world is that this is now a little bit dated, as you'll see, but 32% of the countries on earth have high or very high restrictions on religious freedom, and that covers 70% of the population of the world because it includes China, Indonesia, India, and some other very big countries. The problem is the situation is getting worse. The color code corresponds to those things in the prior graphs, and the high or very high percentage is going up. So this is a problem. Why do states do this? Well, there are some reasons. This is based on some empirical work by Jonathan Fox at Bar-Ilan. He says maybe it's because minorities are seen as non-indigenous. Minorities are seen as cults. Their past conflicts. Their perceptions of threats. Their security threats. Anti-Semitism, and one could go on. Which countries discriminate more? In some ways, the findings are a little bit surprising. On the one hand, it's not exactly surprising that some of the majority Muslim countries tend toward discrimination, but it's also true that European and Western non-Orthodox Christian majority democracies have significant problems. Christian Orthodox majority states are particularly prone to be discriminatory against others. Same is true of Buddhist majority states, and you don't think of communism as a religion, but it has some of the same impacts. Why do states target minorities? Societal religious discrimination leads to government-based discrimination, and sometimes it's not always the case, but particularly where there's some kind of existential threat, there are temptations to overregulate. So Muslims may be perceived as a threat in Christian majority countries. Non-indigenous groups like Christian sects in communist, Buddhist, or Hindu settings. Religious ideology may be an issue. Proselytism can be a problem. So this is not a comprehensive list, but these represent some of the temptations, if you will, to violate freedom of religion or belief. I'm just going to refer briefly to this new publication put out by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. They've spent the past 5 years looking carefully at a lot of these situations where you have the temptation to overregulate freedom of religion. And what this work tries to do, and I think it does a very good job, of identifying critical areas where there's a tendency to overregulate, which results in reducing rather than increasing security. One of the interesting findings was that the rules governing registration of religious organizations are particularly prone to trigger and to be guilty of causing overreactions. But you can see similar kinds of problems with respect to hate speech, profiling, and proselytism or conversion, or regulating that kind of area of freedom of expression. I think I'm running out low on time. I, in some ways, just wanted you to be aware that this is out there. It's a really excellent study looking at a lot of different countries and really trying to cover the balance. Well, I see I'm out of time. What I want to do is just maybe. I'm not. What I'm really getting to is institutional places where we see the role institutions can play in making things better. And it's critically important that we protect the rights of institutions, such as the institutions we've been seeing here, the list of unification church-related entities that we've been watching as we go through these sessions. And so many of us have other institutions that we're conscious of and protecting. And these kinds of religious civil society institutions play a tremendous role. If I had more time, I would talk about some of the things we're doing in the G20 setting with institutions, with trying to bring religious voices to bear on some of these security and other related questions. Because very often religious communities see things in ways that normal secular policymakers don't always see or understand, and they can make a huge difference. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.